We're now going to take a look at terrain sculpting and painting material distributions within the terrain editor. I'm going to add in a standard terrain to the scene, and I also want to note that every time you add in a new terrain, it will be different, and they are randomly generated. Now I'm using a standard terrain, and if we go down to the lower right, we can generate new terrains. And before I really only show this with procedural terrains, kind of changing the seed, it acts pretty much the same way within a standard terrain, except we can't access the procedural that's generating it. Now, first of all, if you're not really fond of the color map used to generate the height of the terrain, where we can see the different color changes, if we look on the bottom under the altitudes, you can right-click on the color bar and select to edit the color map or to load in a different color map. So if we edit the color map, we can see all of the different key colors that are generating this map. And then if we load in a color map, we can choose from some of the terrain editor maps that are available with the program. You can also create and customize your own. So if you edit the color map, you can customize it, select to save it, or you can generate a new one, which is going to reset it. And just to show you some of the other available options for terrains, if we go down to the clip on the bottom, I'm going to clip the terrain, dragging this slider down from the bottom to clip the under part. So now if we take a look at the terrain, what we're going to see is that that bottom part of the geometry is now gone. And I'm going to switch this over to asymmetrical terrain. And we can even see in the editor that we have a mirrored terrain and elevation on the bottom. So that's kind of a neat feature. If we turn off the symmetrical option and take a look at the bottom of the terrain, what we're going to see is a flat polygon. And what this is doing is kind of filling in the terrain and cutting it off, as if we were to slice a piece off. If we switch it over to the skin only and now take a look, we're going to see just the underneath of the geometry. So you could even flip over the terrain, and although we're not seeing the double-sided polygon, that geometry is there from the underneath part of the terrain. Just going to delete it, add a new one into the scene, and let's take a look at some of the painting and sculpting options that are available. Now there are two different sets of brushes, 3D brushes and 2D brushes. Let's first take a look at the 2D brushes, which is the change of elevation up and down rather than any sort of 3D effects. So just as the terrain is generated, which would be by default on the Z-axis. To navigate, we can right-click and move around. You can hold down Shift to kind of pan around, and then you can use the scroll to zoom in and out. All of these functions are also compatible with pressure-sensitive tablets, which is really helpful. Now the first option we have is just the raise option, which allows it to just kind of raise up the elevation. We can see right now it's going a little slow. Let's go ahead and just zoom in, and there are two different ways to, well, one effectively zoom and another one's move closer. If we hold down the Control key and right click, what it's going to do is change the focal length of the camera in the terrain editor. And then if you hold down Control and Shift, it'll move you closer. And it looks like maybe, in this case, it's going way too slow. And I'm hardly seeing the effects of the raised brush. This is probably just a problem right now. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of reboot the program, bring in a different terrain. Once again, I'm using the pre-release, so I might run into a few problems here or there. So I'll just go ahead and restart this. Okay, so new terrain, and as you can see now that 2D brush is working just fine. I was messing around with some of the keyboard shortcuts, which probably triggered something. But one thing I want to mention, which is pretty cool, is there are different ways to change the size of the brush. If you hold down Shift and then click and move left or right, you can increase and decrease the size of the brush, which is a nice quick shortcut. Raise up higher areas, go down a little smaller, work on some of the more fine details. And if you hold down Control and move left or right, you can adjust the flow. And you can see that flow amount moving in and out. So a much smaller amount up into a higher amount of flow. So some really nice, easy access shortcuts. If you want to reverse the effect and kind of dig into the terrain, you can invert it. A keyboard shortcut for that is V. Because I is tied to one of the 3D tools of Inflate. So it is V. You can go back and forth between invert and then raising. The next 2D is an altitude. What we can do is use the sampler to sample an altitude. And now we're going to see a clipping range. Not really a clipping, but just to show you the altitude you'll be painting at. And this will equalize areas around that plane that we're seeing and basically paint everything to that altitude. So if it's higher than the altitude amount, it'll lower it. If it's lower, it'll higher and raise the amount. So that's a pretty nice little tool. The other is effects. You can control any of the list of effects you can see here and paint them directly onto your terrain. And using the airbrush mode, the longer you keep the brush in that area, it'll continue to apply the effect and increase its intensity. We switch over to the touch-ups, which is technically a third set of brushes in a way. You can smooth out the terrain. You can also undo. Which should kind of bring it back to more of the original state. It doesn't really seem to be working all that well at the moment. Up at the top, there's also undo options. You can go back quite a few steps. If we take a look at constrained to clipping range, it'll allow us to create an effective area to paint onto. And we also want to show the clipping ranges up at the top next to where the shininess option is. And this way we're only working within the defined clipping range. So we can cut out the top, cut out the bottom, and only paint within the selected area, which is a pretty nice little feature. Go ahead and turn that off. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the 3D modes. The first mode we have is Sculpt. What this is going to do is take the direction of the brush when initially clicked and apply that to the entire brush stroke, so until you let go. So if we take a look at, I guess, where the normal would be facing, where we can see that line coming out, and now I click, it's going to continue in that direction until I let go, or let up on the tablet, if you're using a pressure-sensitive tablet, or unclick, stop clicking if you're using the mouse. The freeform mode will conform to the direction of the normal, and constantly change depending on the direction of the polygon surface and the direction of the terrain. So we can see it is constantly changing regardless of the continuation of the brush stroke. when you're using the 3D modes and you start to pull the geometry out, what View is going to do is multiply the polygon amount and increase the quality of the terrain in that area. So you don't have to worry about creating a polygonal look where you've pulled out the terrain a lot. So we can see a very interesting looking effect there. We can go ahead and smooth out some of the areas if needed. And then you can paint back on top of it. To reverse the effect and basically go inward instead of outward, you would just use that invert. So V on the keyboard for the shortcut, or clicking invert, and that way we can dig out areas and kind of make caves. Or you can push back some of the zones, depending on if you're using freeform or sculpt. It will end up with different effects, and sometimes you can come into some problems with too much overlapping, so you might want to smooth out that area if that happens. And it might jump over between kind of a low poly version while you're painting sometimes. It's just kind of updating, and then it'll refresh and show the higher polygon amount. The last 3D tool is the Inflate command. We'll go ahead and turn off invert for this. And this is just going to kind of bulge out the terrain. So if you do this around closer areas and sections, it will overlap them and create seams. Sometimes that's kind of a neat look. And it will still work with all the effects and take into account all of the 3D sculpted areas, so you can end up with some really cool looking terrains this way. I'm going to go ahead and just reset this, add a mountain, and now we're kind of back to fresh terrain. There are some additional options available in the brush tip where we can see we can adjust the fall off, and this is based on a filter. So if you want, you can double click to load in different filters, or you can right click, edit the filter to create your own custom filter, and this adjusts the fall off of the brush. There's a couple of presets you can change and edit, save them out. So if we edit the filter, we can save it, load it, or reset it, create a new one. And you can also use images to create brushes, and we can see that this little icon right here. We can click to load in different images that we would want to use as brushes. And I'm going to go through and just select one of my brushes. And I am going to use JPEGs for this because this is part of the 1500 Alpha Brushes collection, and the other brushes are PSD files. So let's go ahead and use an image. And I might need to invert in order to get this to show up correctly, because we can see a box showing. The brushes used for painting are inverted of height maps. So instead of black being the lowest part of the brush, it's actually going to be the highest. So in this case, it would need to be reset and inverted. You can right click to turn it off, and the slider that's right next to it will allow you to adjust the resolution and the polygon count based on the brush effect. It will increase the resolution of the terrain and polygon count in order to conform a little better to the brush. Let's really quick take a look at the material painting. What we can do is define different materials, and you do have to be in the 2D modes for this to work. So we can select Material 1, I'm going to use Grass, and then Material 2 would not be definable. That's part of the material that's already existing on the terrain. So that would be changed outside of the editor. But now what we can do is paint on different materials to control a distribution. So I'm just going to click OK. And now we're going to see a default material on top of the grass I just loaded in. This works as a mixed material, and the distribution is a projected texture map, which is being painted within the terrain editor. If we go over to the Links tab, in the lower right, we can see the texture map. If we right-click, we can see it is synchronized, and it's synchronized to the terrain editor rather than an outside file. And the size and the resolution is defined by the size of the terrain itself. And I want to note that if you reset the terrain, that image or material distribution is not reset. So what we can do to reset this is go into the material and into the distribution of material 1 and 2, either right mouse click and reset the function, click OK, go back into the terrain, and now we'll have a new one. It's going to completely remove that material, and you'll be able to reset it that way. Other than that, there's really no way to reset it directly in the terrain editor at the moment. But these material effects are not limited to direct painting. We can also control with erosion and the global effects. So I'm going to start to add some diffusive erosion, and what we're going to see is as the erosion is being applied, the additional material is being painted. This allows for a really cool distribution of materials to be automatic. And you can also see that the undo command at the moment is not working for the materials. And switching back and forth between which material is controlling also doesn't seem to be applying. So you might be confined to one material. I'm going to go back, reset this, reset the terrain, and create something a little more interesting. So we can adjust the hardness of the rock and the overall effect, apply these different erosions, and we'll throw one thing of gravel on there, maybe some stones, go back and do some more erosion effects, click OK. We'll be able to see that map. You can also export this image. So if we right click in that links where we can see the texture map, we can export the link, which will allow us to choose which format we want to export it as, and you can reload that in if you want to do any outside editing. The smoothing between the two surfaces is controlled by the smooth blending strip, also the overall material amount. I'm going to switch this default material that I had and change that to, let's go ahead and choose one of the material layers, and we'll select the large scale rock, ignore the alpha information, and it looks like because of the way I was editing this, the mixed material might have got a little messed up. If we look at the material tab, we can see there's more than one mixed material. So the one that is being controlled is now this main material, and we have these other ones in between. So we're going to go to this default, change it to a simple material to try to override what has happened. So now we're back to a main mixed material with that distribution, and that should show up correctly. And now we can see the two different materials applying with the distribution of the painted material. So you can create some pretty interesting effects this way. If you want to swap it, and have a reverse effect, all you got to do is use that swap command. And that image, you can either export the link to reload it in, or editing the function, you can select that texture, Control-C to copy, maybe bring it into the alpha, paste it in, Control-V, or use the copy and paste commands at the top of the function editor, and have it controlled in other ways. So there are different ways to use these maps and get some pretty neat looking material distributions. So I'm not going to go really in depth with this too much more. I do want to show another option, just loading in another terrain. I'm going to quick add an ecosystem to this, selecting a plant. Let's just use the maple tree. We'll populate it, and if we open the terrain editor and view the scene, we can now see the ecosystem directly on top of the terrain itself. So if you make any modifications, it will go over the ecosystem, and you will have to repopulate. But if there are other terrains in the scene as well, those will also show up with their ecosystems in the terrain editor. So that's a really nice way to be able to view the rest of the scene and make any edits or modifications. Some of the tools may not work while this is active, mainly using procedural terrains in zones, so you might have to check it off. But some pretty cool stuff that's available within the terrain editor and being able to modify materials. You could also use those distribution images, as I'd copy and pasted before with the texture map, to control the distribution and density of an ecosystem with variable density. And now with having a little bit of an ecosystem, if we take a look in the Links tab, we can also see the image maps for the maple tree within the Links tab. So those can also be saved and edited that way. There's just one last thing I'm going to show in the terrain editor before we continue to other areas of the application, and just loading in a new standard terrain. If we open up the editor and take a look under the picture option, we'll see a preview of the existing terrain, and what we can do is actually load in a height map image and apply it, either blending with the terrain or replacing it. So I'm going to click to load, and I'm just going to use one of my brushes. And we can see that applying over the top of the terrain, adjust the blending amount to the picture or to the terrain itself in the existing area. Click preview, and it's going to show us in the terrain editor what it's going to look like. There's also different blend modes, subtract from it, multiply. So you could import DEM data and create terrains that way. If we go to options, we can also adjust the noise distribution, altitude distribution, set up a seed for the noise, edit these filters. So there's a lot of different ways to manipulate these terrains. Up at the top, you can also filter the altitude, modify a filter. You can also add in, say, a noise or a fractal within the function editor and apply that over the top of the terrain. And then you can also equalize the terrain, invert it if you want everything to go down inward. So there's quite a few tools to play with. Of course, you can always run over these other effects as well and create some really interesting looking terrains.